This is Unit 4 review, and this was our section on learning, and it included conditioning, observational learning, all that good stuff. So, conditioning is the process of training or teaching an animal or a person to behave in a certain way. We've got classical conditioning, where we're pairing two stimuli, something that's automatic and something that's neutral, and we're associating Pavlov and Watson with those. And then we've got operant conditioning, which is teaching through reinforcement and punishment, and that's B.F. Skinner and also Edward Thorndike for that one. Famous quote, John Watson said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants in my own special world, and I can train them to become whatever I want." And that's just the idea that's kind of the key thing here of behaviorism, which is of the nurture perspective. Watson said that you could train anybody or anything to behave a certain way because we all started out as a blank slate, also known as a tabula rasa. Insight learning is when we have that sudden aha moment where we reorganize our information in our brain in a new way to solve a problem. Wolfgang Kohler, studied insight learning in chimps. He piled boxes in their cage, and there were bananas, and they had to figure out that if you stacked the bananas, you could stack the boxes, you could reach the bananas. And they solved those problems. And that aha moment where they figured out how to stack the boxes was known as insight. Latent learning, often what we call hidden learning, is when we subconsciously retain information without any kind of reinforcement or motivation. Tolman studied this in his rats, who are allowed to explore a maze with the entrance and the exits closed, and there was no reinforcement given. Then later, they ran through the same maze, and there was a reward. There was food at the end, and the rats were able to go through the maze the fastest way possible because they had spent time building a cognitive map, unconsciously building this mental map of it, or of the maze. So that was latent learning. Social learning, this was Bandura, says we learn through observing and imitating others. Associations, we'll dive deeper into this with classical and operant conditioning. Taste aversions, this was studied by John Garcia. He said that we are biologically predisposed to form certain aversions. So for example, if you get sick from something, your brain will tell you this made us sick, and next time you will want to avoid that because you got sick the first time. Instinctive drift says that when you're teaching a species to do something that goes against its natural behavior, like teaching a dog not to bark at a loud noise, if you do not continue to reinforce that behavior, it will instinctively drift back to its natural behavior. Another association is learned helplessness, when we learn to associate our action with failure due to persistent failures in the past. In this experiment, the dogs were in two different groups. In one, they were able to escape the shocks, and in another, they could never escape the shocks. When the dogs moved to the box where they could escape the shocks, the ones who had not been there didn't try because previously they were never able to escape shocks. So it was sad. They just kept getting shocked, even though they could have found a way to get away from them. Our main person that we're associating with classical conditioning is Ivan Pavlov. Remember that Pavlov himself was not a psychologist. He did not discover conditioning on accident or on purpose. It was an accident that he discovered while studying the salivation of dogs. In his experiment, he had a dog who was hooked up to this harness. He found that when he brought out meat powder, the dog would start salivating before the powder even came out because the dog had learned to form an association. So later, he did it more intentionally. He had a neutral stimulus. It was actually a tuning fork, and originally there was no response to the tuning fork. Then he had an unconditioned stimulus, which was meat powder, and that caused an unconditioned response of salivation. When Pavlov paired those together, the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, initially there was not a response. But the more he paired them together, the dog would salivate because he was already learned to salivate to the meat powder. Eventually, the dog learned to salivate only to the bell, and the bell became a conditioned response, and salivation to the bell became a conditioned response. So again, our unconditioned stimulus naturally triggers a response. Our unconditioned response is that unlearned natural response to the unconditioned stimulus. And then our conditioned stimulus was what was previously neutral and now has become a learned stimulus that can trigger a learned response. In this case, salivation to the bell or to the tuning fork. Different names of things along the way in the process. Acquisition is what we call it when the response was first established. So the first time the dog started to salivate to the bell alone, that was acquisition. If we stop pairing those things together over time, that conditioned response will go away, and we call that classical conditioning. So when an unconditioned stimulus no longer follows a conditioned stimulus, that's called extinction. Occasionally, though, there will be a spontaneous recovery. If it has gone extinct, there's been a rest period, and that behavior returns, then that would be called a spontaneous recovery. Stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. Generalization is when the dogs were taught to salivate to anything similar to the tuning fork. That's generalization. When they were taught that they could only salivate to just that one specific tuning fork, that was discrimination. Higher order conditioning is where something that was previously learned can act as an unconditioned stimulus. So, for example, here in first order conditioning, we had burger, and then that was paired with the arches. So the arches trigger salivation. Well, now we can make it to where that restaurant and the arches can become an unconditioned stimulus that will trigger salivation. John B. Watson becomes known as our father of behaviorism. So even though Pavlov was studying behaviorism, he wasn't a psychology person. He was a different type of scientist. So Watson is considered the founder of behaviorism. Watson is most famous for the famous Little Albert experiment, in which he documented the conditioning of an emotional response to little Albert. In that study, the neutral stimulus was a white rat. The unconditioned stimulus was a loud banging sound. So he paired the white rat with a loud banging sound, and then Albert's unconditioned response was fear, or to be startled. Eventually, with pairing those together, Albert learned to fear the white rat. And he generalized that fear by teaching him not to fear only white rats, but bunny rabbits, Santa Claus beards, any kind of soft fabric, but anything that was like soft and furry. All right, so the difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning deals more with reflexive responses that precede a response. Operant conditioning is a voluntary response, deals more with stimulus events that follow a response, like a consequence. So, for example, studying is not a reflex, so exams and grades come after the studying. That would be an operant conditioning. Other key thing, again, operant conditioning is voluntary. Classical conditioning is reflexive. E.L. Thorndike studied instrumental learning, what was later called operant conditioning, and his experiment was with cats in puzzle boxes, or the law of effect. Thorndike's puzzle box found that hungry cats in a puzzle box would work diligently to solve the problem by trial and error, and eventually they would get out. So when there was a reward, they liked it and they got out. Later, B.F. Skinner, he basically did the same thing. That if you like the rewards of something, you continue the behavior. Responses followed by favorable consequences. He created the operant chamber, or the Skinner box, in which pigeons and rats were taught to behave differently based on shocks and also based on rewards. So some key terms here. Reinforcement is anything that increases a response. Punishment is anything that decreases the response. And we have different types of reinforcers. A primary reinforcer satisfies a biological need. A secondary reinforcer is something that has a learned value, like money and praise. So we use this graphic here to compare positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment. So reinforcement, again, increases the behavior. So for example, cheerleaders give praise. That helps the team score more points. That is positive reinforcement. We're adding praise, and that increases the behavior. The negative reinforcement, this thing is in the way. I don't know how to make that go away. But we remove an angry fan from the crowd, and then that causes the team to, oh, there it is. Negative fan is removed from the stands, helping the team score more points. So we're still increasing the behavior, but we did it by removing something. Punishment decreases a behavior. So in this case, a child gets spankings for throwing a temper tantrum. So we're adding spankings. That's positive because we're adding a stimulus, and that decreases the behavior. On the other side, the child gets a timeout for throwing temper tantrums. So they're losing their free time. So the behavior decreases, and we removed a stimulus. Generally, with reinforcement, an immediate reinforcer is going to be better than delayed gratification. Shaping, we did this by doing an example where we clapped in class to create new behaviors. Or if you've ever seen any kind of show where people are teaching an animal how to do a series of tricks, when they teach them one trick, by rewarding everything that they do that's close to what they want, that's called shaping. And when they link lots of shaped behaviors together, that's called chaining. We watched the example of rats playing basketball. So for each little behavior they taught the rats to do, they did that through shaping with reinforcement. And then the rats being able to play basketball all together, that was chaining. Excuse me. Skinner said when we reinforced behaviors affected how well they were learned. In a continuous schedule of reinforcement, the reinforcement occurs after every single response. So every time they did something or you could do something wrong, you're either punished or rewarded every single time. You're going to learn it very quickly, but it also stops as soon as that reward or punishment stops. In a partial schedule of reinforcement, the reinforcement or the punishment occurs some of the time, but not all of the time. And partially reinforced behaviors tend to last much longer because you're going to keep doing what you're going to do because you don't know when the reward or punishment could happen. It could happen next time or the time after that. You're not sure, so you keep doing it. Different schedules for reinforcement. Ratio schedules are based on the amount of responses. So, for example, a fixed ratio schedule would be like a car salesman who gets a bonus every 5 cars he sells. A variable ratio is the amount varies unpredictably. That if he sells 5 cars one month, maybe it's 7 cars another month, the amount varies unpredictably. A slot machine is considered a variable ratio because you do not know how many times you have to pull the lever or play the game before you will win. Interval schedules are based on time, the amount of time in between responses. So a fixed interval schedule, a car salesman gets a standard paycheck every 2 weeks, or if we take a quiz every Friday. The space or the interval between the responses, between the quizzes or between the paychecks is the same. Variable interval, it varies unpredictably. We don't know when the boss will come by, so we don't know when we'll get a bonus. Pop quizzes, we don't know what day they're going to be, so that varies. Variable interval schedule. Punishments in general are considered not to be ideal because they can increase aggression, cause avoidance behaviors. Biofeedback is a type of reinforcement. We talked about where they use electronic devices to provide feedback. You could try to control your blood pressure, your heart rate by watching a monitor. And the example that we watched in class was trying to control bowel movements using biofeedback. Our last type of learning is cognitive social theory, observational learning, the notion that humans can learn through observation of models, that you can watch somebody and you can learn about it, you can think about it and learn. We've talked about all of these already. The evolution of behaviorism, we had Pavlov with classical conditioning, Skinner with operant conditioning, and then the most recent is Bandura with social modeling. Bandura said that observational learning requires paying attention and perceiving another's behavior, remembering that behavior, and then reproducing and being motivated to carry out the behavior. He showed this with his Bobo doll study, which indicated that children learn through imitating others who receive reward and punishments without receiving those rewards and punishments. The independent variable was exposure to an aggressive model. The dependent variable was how much they imitated them. And those children, you'll recall from the video, definitely imitated the aggressive behavior. So his conclusions, Bandura said that aggression is a learned behavior, not an inbuilt instinct, and that learning can take place in the absence of any reinforcement. It was only through observation. That is all of Unit 4 and learning.